Thank you very much, Volker, for the kind introduction, and most of all for having me a second time at the Weizenbaum Institute. So I hope maybe one day I can also make it in person to Berlin. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining this talk. This is joint work together with Shunya Yan from Santa Clara University, where we examine the trade-offs of polarizing news and the trade-offs that publishers are facing when they are offering these news. So let me start with a motivating example from the Washington Post covering the No Kings protests in the United States. So you can essentially see three headlines, the same outlet, same story, but very different tones. So the first article basically says, No Kings protests return as Trump ramps up authoritarian practices, organizers say. So this is somewhat charged, kind of inflammatory language, high and effective polarization. But the Washington Post also reports in a more neutral way about the same event. In the second article, No Kings protests against Trump draw huge crowds across the country. They kind of describe the street carnival atmosphere. So this is much more neutral, low and effective polarization. And we actually also found an example of the same article, which is more leaning towards ideological polarization, which is an editorial opinion piece where they warn Trump about these protests, similar to what happened 2009 with the Tea Party, which is kind of a ideological leaning that is communicated here. So you can see even within one outlet, we can have very different stories, very different polarization profiles. And this, of course, raises an important question that we are interested in, which is, does polarizing news actually turn clicks into subscriptions? So in other words, do publishers economically benefit with regard to their subscription business from offering polarizing news? So what we know already is that polarizing news can lead to more engagement in the short term in the form of clicks and more time on site. But does it also increase long-term commitment in the form of subscriptions? That's what we're trying to investigate in this paper. So let's have a look at the economics slash marketing IS literature that we are focusing on in this work. What has been done and established so far? So mainly three things. First of all, prior literature has looked at different dimensions of polarized content. First of all, ideological polarization, which mainly addresses left-right policy positions, and also a second dimension, which is called affective polarization. So this refers to the emotionality of the news. It's often referred to as us versus them tone, and we actually measure both of these dimensions. Second, the literature has studied consumer preferences for polarized news, and there basically the research asks, do people want confirmation biased news, or do they prefer rather balanced news? It turns out that the literature finds that actually both is the case, but there is an important gap here. Most of this research has actually studied these questions, focusing on the click behavior of consumers without looking at actual economic commitments in the form of subscriptions. And of course, you could argue that potentially consumer preferences for polarizing news may be different if you have to pay for it. And the third stream of literature that we're contributing to is the outcomes of polarized news content. So there, the literature mainly looked at downstream effects such as political attitudes, economic decisions, and social behavior. And we are adding to this literature by contributing kind of a first order impact of polarization. So what is our contribution to this literature? First of all, we provide a new outcome of polarized content. We look at engagement, in our case, time on site and subscription behavior. So this is really this first order effect preceding broader political or societal impacts. We have a novel data source, so we collaborate here with a large-scale European news publisher where we have access to demand and supply data. So we have about 14 million page views over 40 weeks of demand, but also about 63,000 articles over those 40 weeks that were published. So we have all this information available. And to train one of our polarization measures, we also collected all of the parliamentary speeches during those 40 weeks, which we'll use as a training data sets for one of our polarization measures. We measure polarization as a multidimensional construct. So we use a BERT classification and an LLM classification. We measure affective polarization and ideological polarization along different dimensions. For example, along the economic leaning of the article, like is it left or right? Is it pro-growth or pro-environment? And we do that within one publisher studying article level data in the European Union. So we do that outside of the United States, while most of the prior literature has actually studied these questions in US data sets. So what we do is we estimate the effect of polarized content on user engagement and subscriptions. Here we have an identification challenge to solve. So we isolate the effect of polarized content from self-selection. And here we exploit two set of instruments. So we have a first instrument, which is a shock-based instrument. We can leverage a national election, which is mainly operating on the demand side, and on the supply side, we can use what is called a Bartik instrument. So I'll talk more about this in the identification section. And we also think of why this is happening. So we want to better understand basically what is the effect of polarized content versus non-polarized content. So what is the mechanism? Why is this happening? And we also look at the heterogeneity across users, looking at their prior political beliefs as inferred by their voting shares, as well as their baseline news consumption. So this is in a nutshell what we're trying to do. And the key findings of the paper are summarized on this slide. So you can see that essentially consuming polarized content increases engagement, as we also expected. Time on site goes up, but interestingly, subscriptions go down. And the mechanism for this is strong substitution. So consumers that look at polarizing content, for them, their engagement goes up, but it also means that they are not reading or they are less reading non-polarizing or more balanced content. And we also see that across users, right economic framing hurts actually subscriptions the most. If you live in a conservative area, this softens the effect somewhat. So this is somewhat a confirmation for confirmation bias, but it doesn't completely flip the effect to positive. So this is what we kind of find, and let me kind of illustrate a little bit more in detail how we are getting to those results. Let me talk a little bit more about the empirical setting and the data we have to study our question. So we are working here with a premium online European daily newspaper. So they also have a printed version, but we focus here on the online operation. You can think of kind of like a New York Times, Financial Times, or a Guardian. So it's a rather general news publisher covering international news, politics, business, science, tech, sports. It's among the top 10 in weekly usage in its country. And what is interesting and also important for the identification later on is that 80% of the traffic from this news publisher originates in its home country, and about 20% originates in the rest of the world. What is important here to understand is monetization. So this news publisher has an ad-based business model, but they also sell subscriptions, kind of like the old printed newspaper model. So they use a metered paywall. You register. When you register, you get 10 articles for free per month, and the subscription price is relatively expensive. So you pay 33 euros per month, and we see actually 10.1 single purchase per week of users, but also some users have multiple purchases. And the reason is because there are multiple subscription products, like, for example, daily passes or access to archival content and things like that. So it's not just access to the paid content, like the paywall content, but there are also other digital products available that consumers can purchase and which is part of our data. Let me talk a little bit more about our measure of political polarization. So essentially what we do in the study is we have two measures of polarization. One is political party reference data, and the other one is a reader referenced measure of polarization. First here, the party reference measure of polarization. So what we do here is we use the parliamentary speeches and pre-period news data from our publisher as a training data. And then we train a hierarchical BERT model in a two-stage process where we first figure out basically for a respective news article, is this article polarized? And then in the second stage, is it polarizing to the left, to the right, or to the center, a rather neutral positioning? So what we get from the BERT measure is this party referenced measure of polarization, and we get a classification whether an article is basically left, right, or neutral. And we complement this measure of polarization with a reader reference measure of polarization following recent advances in large language models and research there that showed that LLM-based classifications are actually able to substitute user judgments in this area. So we can safely assume basically that LLMs are able to reproduce users' kind of perceptions or, and scores of polarization. This is what we're using here to classify our news articles. So we get for each article a score, whether it's, for example, effectively polarizing, a rationale for that, and a confidence score. And we use this process to kind of obtain our measures not only of ideological polarization, which is the measure that we get for the party reference measure, the BERT measure, but we can also get effective polarization and three measures of ideological polarization along three dimensions that are important to the country that we are studying, and that is basically the economic leaning of the article. Is it left or right? The globalization leaning, basically, is it globalist versus nationalist? And then the environmental leaning, is it pro-environment or pro-growth, for example? So we have a rich set of polarization measures, which we think of as distinct, but of course, related. And we also see in the results later on that we get some interesting differences across those different measures of polarization. So let me talk a little bit more about the identification strategy. So that's probably the most technical part of this talk. So what we are doing here is we are running this baseline regression. So we are regressing engagement or subscriptions on polarizing articles. So this is the count of polarizing articles that a consumer is consuming in a specific week regarding one of those measured polarization dimensions. And of course, we also include consumer fixed effects. For example, we account by doing so for differences in education, for example, or news preferences. We have weak effects, which take care of common shocks, like major breaking news, for example. And then we have a bunch of control variables, such as where you exposed to subscription prompts, or what is the sentiment of the news, where you logged in, and did you click on non-polarizing content, for example. So this is our baseline specification, but of course, the problem here is heterogeneity. So users who click on polarizing content may differ systematically from users who do not click, and we address this issue with two instrumental variables. One is on the demand side, so we exploit a federal election in our home country, and we use a second instrument, which is a Bartik style IV instrument. So let me talk a little bit more about those instruments. So here you can see some more details on the election IV. So what is the idea here? It's a demand-side instrument that exploits a federal election during our observation window. The election IV is essentially an interaction between a user being from our home country and a 4-week election window. So we're not necessarily only looking at the election itself, but also like allow for a broader window. And the idea here is that home country users face an exogenous demand shock for political news during the election. And of course, political news is the most polarized content category on the site. And the control users in this case would be users that have the same language as our focal country, but are not exposed to this election because, of course, it's a different political system in the other country. So that's our demand side instrument. We also have a supply side instrument. This is a so-called shift share instrument, which has become quite popular in the economics literature, a little bit less popular and known in the marketing literature. So what we are doing here is we are essentially interacting the user's pre-period topic preferences. So that's their share with weekly topic level supply shocks, which essentially accounts for the shift in polarizing content, which is completely driven by the decisions of the news publisher. And essentially an example here would be to give you a better understanding of how this works is if you read business news, for example, and there's suddenly more polarizing business content available in a specific week, you're more likely to encounter it. But essentially this supply shock is of course exogenous from your individual demand. And in that sense, this Bartik IV allows us to study the impact of the variation in supply of polarizing news on your engagement and subscription behavior. So to make this a little bit more concrete, here are some descriptive statistics on the Bartik IVs. On the left-hand side, you can see the shares. They have a high variation, so you can see the pre-preferences of consumers across sports, science, culture, business, and politics. And on the right-hand side, you can see the shifts. So this is the shifts in the supply of polarizing news, and the darker it is, the more polarizing news is being supplied. And this fluctuates nicely across the shifts and shares, which kind of gives us the necessary variation to identify our effect. So let's talk a little bit about the relevance of the instruments. This is what you can see here in the so-called first stage regressions and here for affective polarization. So what we do here is you can basically see we regress the polarizing articles on our instruments and the controls, and you can see that the necessary condition is here fulfilled, that we see here a positive correlation between the instruments and the number of polarizing articles that our reader is consuming. So in that sense, the relevance condition of our instruments seems to be fulfilled. And if you look at the exogeneity condition, we can show you here for the election IV, for example, some parallel pre-treatment trends and post-treatment trends. So you can see prior to the federal election, which would be happening here at the dotted line. Basically, we can see no difference in the trends in engagement on the left-hand side and subscriptions on the right-hand side between the treatment and the control group. So the users living in our focal country versus the same language users living in our control country. And the effect of the election precisely appears when the election begins and kind of persists afterwards. So you can already see a taste of the results here, basically that the engagement increases after the polarization shock, but then the subscriptions decrease on the right-hand side. We also run a couple of diagnostic tests for our Bartik instruments, so this is rather technical. I don't want to go into too much detail here, but basically the main takeaway is that those diagnostics look supportive for the exogeneity of our instrument, which gives us kind of confidence in our results. And if you want to learn more about this, I'm happy to talk more about this in the Q&A section, but we also talk about this in detail, of course, in the paper directly. More interesting, let's have a look at the results and the causal effects. So here are the results for the effective polarization for the Bartik and election IV. And you can see essentially that looking at the results for the Bartik IV, that one additional click on an effectively polarizing article increases the time on site by about 2.6 log points. So this is roughly 15 to 20 real seconds for the median user, which corresponds to a significant engagement boost. But for subscriptions on the right-hand side, you can see there's actually a negative effect of minus 0.062 percentage points with the election IV. So you can already see here that for effective polarization, basically the overall picture is that polarization increases engagement but reduces subscriptions. And we see a similar picture overall for the ideological polarization measures. So here for ideological polarization based on the BERT measure, for example, you can see that there is a very strong negative effect or a stronger negative effect of right-leaning content on subscriptions than left-leaning content. And regarding the LLM measures, we again see a consistent picture, for example, for the Bartik IV, that economic right-leaning content, globalist content, nationalist content, or environmental right-leaning content all increase engagement, except for environmental left-leaning content, and that economic right-leaning content and environmental right-leaning content decrease subscriptions. For the Bartik IV, we do not find significant effects on the subscriptions, but if we kind of look at the totality of the evidence, we can see this overall picture that polarized content seems to increase engagement but decrease subscriptions under the various measures and identification strategies. So why does this happen? We also look at the mechanism of this effect. So what we're trying to do here is we are regressing clicks on other content categories, so non-political content categories, and test basically whether polarizing content crowds out other readings. And our results show here strong evidence for substitution. So for example, for effective polarized content, we see that the coefficient is minus 1.3. So that means one additional polarizing click reduces other reading by 1.3 articles. We see a similar picture for economic left content. So there the coefficient is minus 3.79. Again, very strong substitution. And for example, all the way at the bottom, pro-growth environmental content shows minus 11.39. So again, extremely strong substitutions. So what that means is essentially that users have a finite attention budget, time budget, and when they consume polarizing content, they don't have any budget left to consume more balanced, kind of high quality journalism that seems to be more important in driving subscription value and subsequent subscriptions for the news publishers. So who is most affected? As a last step, we look at the heterogeneity of our results across consumers. So here we decompose the effect of polarizing content across consumers using their prior political beliefs as a proxy. So we want to know, or what we exploit essentially is the voting shares of consumers as zip codes. So we know where people live, and we can also infer their prior political beliefs using their baseline news consumption. And when we do this exercise, just to give you the main finding is essentially that right-leaning economic content actually hurts subscriptions the most. But what is interesting here is that if you live in a conservative zip code, this effect softens but it doesn't flip the sign to positive, but the damage is kind of reduced. So this suggests some role, as I said in the beginning, for confirmation bias, but it's not strong enough to overcome the fundamental substitution effect that we document. So this means even when content aligns with your beliefs, consuming polarized content still crowds out the content that makes subscriptions valuable in the end of the day. All right, so this is in a nutshell what we have at this point. Let me just quickly summarize and talk a little bit about implications before we go into the discussion. So what did we find? Let's summarize. Polarizing content creates a fundamental dilemma for subscription-focused publishers. It increases short-term engagement on the one hand side, so more time on site, which is nice for advertising revenue, but it also decreases long-term commitment in the form of subscriptions, which is of course valuable and the most valuable and sustainable revenue stream for publishers. The mechanism is content substitution. So polarizing content crowds out balanced news. Right-leaning economic framing is particularly damaging to subscriptions, which suggests that polarization or offering polarizing content may be value destroying for publishers pursuing subscription models. If you want to put it in one line, basically our main result is that polarizing content essentially increases engagement. So there's an engagement gain, but subscription pain. And we did some small back on the envelope calculation here to show the magnitude of the effect. So one extra click on a polarizing article actually leads to an 11 euro expected revenue loss in subscription revenue. So quite large economic effects for news publishers. So this is where we are at the moment. What we want to do next, and maybe it also would be good to get some feedback on this from the participants here or later on from people watching this on YouTube. So what we want to do next is basically explore some extensions. So first we want to better understand the psychological mechanism. So we are thinking about looking at differences in subscription behavior when people consume more balanced or more accurate news. Second, we want to look at consumer heterogeneity regarding education, for example, and price sensitivity. Third, we're planning to work a little bit more on the longer term, more nuanced effects of subscriptions, essentially looking at the duration of the subscriptions and the lifetime value of the subscriptions. And finally, we will discuss also more in the paper about the managerial implications of the trade-off between short-term ad revenue and long-term subscription revenue. So this is where we are at the moment. Thank you for joining today. And I'm happy to take your questions and I look forward to the discussion. So thanks again for the invitation and I look forward to your questions.